All right, welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving deep, as always, this time into a really powerful tool in Excel.
Exciting.
It can be pretty powerful, but also a bit tricky to wrap your head around at first. But we'll break it down together, no worries.
Right.
It's the DAX function, LL.
Yeah. So many uses for that one.
Exactly. And just a quick reminder, DAX stands for Data Analysis Expressions, which is like a whole library of functions specifically for working with data in Excel, Power BI, all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's a game changer for sure.
Huge. So maybe let's start with like the big picture.
Okay, sure.
What does this function AL actually do? Why is it so powerful?
So imagine you've got a giant spreadsheet, right? Tons of data, and you've got all these filters applied, like narrowing things down to specific regions or dates or product categories, whatever.
Right.
But all L does is basically lift those filters temporarily to let you see the whole picture.
The whole picture, even with filters applied.
Exactly. Like if you were looking at sales data for, say, a coffee chain, and you had a filter on to just see sales in California, you could use AL to see the total coffee sales for all states, even though you're still focused on California.
Ah, I see. So it's not changing the data itself, it's just giving me like a different lens to view it through.
Precisely. It helps you answer those compared to what questions, like how does California's performance stack up against the national picture?
That makes a ton of sense. So instead of just seeing those California numbers in isolation, I can see how they fit into the bigger context.
Exactly. Helps you spot trends, make better decisions, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, I'm starting to get the appeal. So if it's essentially like removing filters, how does that actually work in practice? Like, what's the syntax look like?
It's actually more straightforward than you might think.
Oh, good.
The basic format is ALL, and then in parentheses, you put either the table name or specific columns that you want to remove filters from.
So if I wanted to remove filters from an entire table, I just put the table name in those parentheses.
Yep, exactly like that.
If I only wanted to remove filters from specific columns,
then you just list those columns within the parentheses, separated by commas.
so I can kind of pick and choose which filters to keep and which to temporarily lift. Is that right?
You got it. It's really flexible.
Okay, now this is where I start to get a little tripped up.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about removing filters, but often we're using DAX to do calculations, right?
Right.
So how does AL actually fit into those calculations?
So AL by itself doesn't return a table of data or anything like that. It's more like a modifier. You use it within other DAX formulas to change the set of data that those formulas are working with.
Ah, okay. So it's like a behind-the-scenes operator.
Exactly. It's saying, hey, for this calculation, ignore those filters and use the whole data set instead.
That's really clever. Can you give me a specific example of how that might work in a real-world scenario?
Sure. So let's say you want to calculate each state's sales as a percentage of total U.S. sales.
Okay.
You would use AL to get that total U.S. sales number regardless of any filters you have applied.
So even if I'm only looking at sales for the West Coast, ALL would still give me the total sales number for the entire country.
Precisely. It lets you make that comparison accurately.
That is super useful. Now, you mentioned something earlier that I wanted to circle back to, auto exist. What's that all about? Is that something I need to worry about when using AL?
So auto-exist is a DAX optimization that can sometimes lead to unexpected results, especially when you're using AL with multiple filters.
Okay.
It's a bit more of an advanced concept, but basically what it does is try to be smart about which filters to apply and which to ignore. But sometimes it can be a little too smart for its own good, especially when you're working with complex formulas.
So not necessarily a deal breaker for someone just starting out with AL.
No, not at all. It's something to keep in mind as you get more comfortable with DAX, but don't let it scare you away from using AL.
Good to know. And you also briefly mentioned some limitations in direct query mode. What should our listeners know about that?
Right. So direct query is basically a way to connect to external data sources directly within Excel without having to import the data first.
Ah, okay.
So it's super useful for working with large data sets, but AL does have some quirks in direct query mode, particularly when it comes to calculated columns and row-level security.
So maybe something to be mindful of if you're working with direct query.
Exactly. It's worth doing a little research on how AL behaves in that environment if you're going to be using it extensively.
Great point. We'll be sure to include some resources in the show notes for folks who want to dig a little deeper.
Awesome.
Now, I know there are a few different ways to use AL, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Can we break those down a bit?
Sure thing. So the simplest way to use AL is with no arguments at all.
Okay, no table, no columns, just AL.
Exactly. And that basically removes all filters from the entire calculation, giving you a completely unfiltered view of your data.
So that's the show me everything option.
Exactly. No filters, no restrictions, just the raw data.
Got it. What about when I want to be a little more selective?
Then you can use AL with a table name in the parentheses, like AL sales, for example.
Okay.
That will remove all filters that are applied to that specific table.
So if I had filters on other tables in my workbook, those would stay in place, right?
Exactly. It's a way to focus on a specific table while still acknowledging that there might be filters affecting other parts of your data.
That's really powerful. And what if I want to be even more granular, like focusing on specific columns?
Then you'd use AL and list those specific columns within the parentheses.
Okay, so AL region product, for example.
Exactly. That would remove any filters applied to the region and product columns while keeping any other filters intact.
So it's like a precision tool for filter removal.
Precisely. You have a lot of control over which filters you want to affect.
That's amazing. Now, is there anything else, any other tricks or variations of LL that our listeners should be aware of?
There's one more that's really handy. Al accept.
L accept. Okay, what's that one do?
So Al accept is kind of the opposite of LO.
Interesting.
Instead of removing all filters, it lets you specify which filters you want to keep.
Okay, so it's saying keep these filters, but get rid of everything else.
You got it. So if you have a complex set of filters applied, but you only want to keep the filter on, say, the region column, you would use Al accept table region.
That's really useful. So it's like a shortcut for situations where you want to preserve specific filters.
Exactly. It can save you a lot of time and effort.
Wow. LL is way more versatile than I initially thought. I can see how it could be applied to so many different scenarios.
Oh, absolutely. The more you use it, the more creative you can get with it.
Now, for our listeners who are hearing all this and thinking, okay, I'm ready to give this a try, what's the best way to start experimenting with LL?
The best way to learn DAX is by doing
Find yourself a spreadsheet with some data you're interested in and just start playing around with ALL.
Just dive in.
Exactly. Try using it in different ways. See what happens. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
That's great advice. And we'll make sure to include some helpful resources in the show notes, including that article on AutoExist that we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
I guess just a reminder that AL can be a really powerful tool for gaining deeper insights from your data.
Yeah.
It might seem a little intimidating at first, but with a bit of practice, it can really unlock a whole new level of analysis.
Absolutely. It's like having a secret weapon in your Excel arsenal.
Exactly.
Well, that's a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the ALL function. We'll be back soon with another episode, exploring a new corner of the data world.
Sounds great.
See you all then.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.